The two brothers who killed each other at Naseby. In June 1645, the English Civil War reached its bloody crescendo at Naseby, a quiet field in Northamptonshire that would become one of the most decisive and haunting battlegrounds in British history. On that morning, two brothers, whose childhood memories once echoed with laughter and shared secrets, prepared to face each other not as family, but as mortal enemies. One wore the red sash of a Royalist, fighting for the embattled King Charles I. The other stood with the parliamentarians, determined to forge a new England free from royal tyranny. Their names, lost to time in some records, are less important than the story they represent, a story of a country and a family torn completely apart. The Battle of Naseby wasn't just another military engagement. It was the day the parliamentarian New Model Army, under Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, confronted the king's best hopes in open combat. The fate of a nation hung in the balance. But for these two brothers, the war was already deeply personal. Imagine the final letter home, written by one of them, perhaps the elder, trying to explain to a grieving mother why he must fight against his own blood. He might have described loyalty to his conscience, a belief in God's plan, or a need to right a political wrong. Yet the words on that page could never truly explain how it felt to ride onto that misty field, knowing your enemy shared your father's eyes. From opposite flanks, the brothers entered the chaos. Naseby was a muddy, pitiless arena, echoing with cannon fire, cavalry charges, and the panicked cries of men realizing that history was happening to them. In the smoke and confusion, alliances vanished, and all that remained was survival. The Royalists, at first, seemed to have the upper hand. Their cavalry, led by the impetuous Prince Rupert, smashed through the parliamentarian left. Yet discipline and organization turned the tide. Cromwell's cavalry countercharged, and the Royalist lines began to collapse. Somewhere amid this swirling violence, the two brothers found each other. Perhaps it was by chance, a collision of fate in the fog of war, or perhaps across the battlefield they had recognized each other's voices or faces, drawn together by a mix of dread and inevitability. There are accounts from survivors, men who later testified with trembling hands, that the brothers called out one another's names before the final clash. The ground was slick with blood and churned earth, the air heavy with gunpowder and the screams of the wounded. Against this apocalyptic backdrop, two men who once shared a cradle now stood with swords drawn, compelled by duty, ideology, and something even darker, the knowledge that neither could truly turn away. No one knows who struck the first blow. Perhaps they fought with the desperate skill of men who know their own mirror image's next move. There may have been a pause, a last moment of hesitation, as memories surged up. The echo of childhood games, the smell of bread in the family kitchen, the voice of their mother calling them home. But then, with all the fury and confusion of civil war burning through them, the final violence erupted. The aftermath of Naseby was catastrophic for the Royalists. King Charles's cause was shattered, his infantry decimated, his secret papers seized, and the war essentially lost in a single afternoon. But for the family of these two brothers, the political outcome meant nothing. When the guns finally fell silent and the living picked through the mangled dead, they found the bodies of the brothers side by side in the mud. Their hands still gripped their swords. Some say the younger's dying hand reached for his brother's. Some say they died at precisely the same moment, neither willing to live with the knowledge of having killed the other. To the soldiers who found them, it was a sight both terrifying and holy, a symbol of how the Civil War had not merely divided England, but torn the very fabric of families. Think of what it means in that moment for two brothers, raised in the same house, loved by the same parents, fed by the same hands, to become enemies by circumstance. They would have grown up listening to the same stories by the hearth, argued over chores, whispered secrets about dreams for the future. But the English Civil War made the private public, forced private grief into the open, and demanded that every man, woman, and child pick a side. There was no room for neutrality, and so their mother's worst nightmare became real. her sons destroyed, not by foreign invaders, but by the ideas that now possessed their countrymen. After Naseby, the family story was retold again and again, passed down as both a warning and a lament. In village inns, in family letters, and even in sermons, their tale became a symbol of the unnatural cruelty of civil war. Neighbors and strangers alike asked themselves, how could this happen? How could a nation, supposedly bound by common blood and faith, produce a battlefield where brothers killed each other face to face? Yet, in many ways, the tragedy of the two brothers was England's tragedy writ small. The war forced fathers to betray sons, wives to inform on husbands, and children to see their homes burned in the name of king or parliament. The story is not only about death, but about the permanent fracture of trust, the shattering of what once seemed unbreakable. The soldiers who buried the brothers did so with an uneasy reverence. Some reports suggest they were wrapped together in the same blanket, as if to reverse the terrible division of their final hour. Others claim a priest, his voice hoarse from so many funerals, muttered a prayer over their bodies, half blessing, half apology. Their graves were unmarked, lost amid hundreds of others. But their memory survived, woven into the fabric of post-war England. For generations, families pointed to the brothers' story as proof of the war's true cost, not in land or crowns, but in the broken bonds between people who should have loved each other above all else. The Battle of Naseby changed the course of English history. It signaled the beginning of the end for the monarchy, the rise of parliamentary power, and the emergence of new freedoms and new uncertainties that would echo through centuries. But for those who still walk those fields today, the greatest lesson comes not from the movement of armies or the ambitions of kings, but from the ghosts of two brothers whose final act was to destroy each other. Their story is a wound in the landscape, a permanent scar reminding us that the fiercest battles are often fought within the family, and that war's legacy is not just written in treaties or law books, but in the quiet grief that never really fades. In the end, the story of the two brothers who killed each other at Naseby is more than a legend. It is a mirror held up to the dark heart of civil conflict. It asks us across centuries what we would do when our deepest loyalties collide, when love and belief become enemies in the same body. It asks us if we are truly ready to pay the price demanded by our convictions. And most hauntingly, it leaves us with an image that cannot be forgotten. Two brothers locked in a final embrace, not of forgiveness, but of fatal certainty, their swords still drawn, lying side by side as England's future was decided around them. The echoes of their tragedy still linger on that field, and in every family torn by war, division, or unhealed wounds. And so their story endures, not just as history, but as warning, as lament, and as a call to remember what is truly at stake whenever brother turns against brother. The wife who turned her husband in. Of all the stories of the English Civil War, few are as haunting as the tale of Anne Evans, the woman who betrayed her husband, divided her family, and condemned herself to a lifetime of loneliness and regret. It's a story that cuts deeper than battlefield betrayals or political maneuvering, because it happened not on the fields of Naseby or Marston Moor, but inside the walls of a family home. This is a true story of loyalty, conviction, fear, and the irreversible consequences of choices made when a nation is at war with itself. Anne Evans was born into the turbulence of 17th century England, when every household was split along invisible lines. The parliamentarians believed in the rule of Parliament, the old ways reformed, and the king's absolute power brought low. The Royalists, or Cavaliers, swore allegiance to King Charles I and the ancient traditions of monarchy. Anne's family were parliamentarians. Her upbringing was strict, guided by the Puritan faith, and marked by a belief in duty, order, and the moral clarity of her cause. She married John Evans, a local landowner, handsome, educated, and, unknown to her parents, secretly a supporter of the king. At first, Anne and John's marriage was marked by the same hopes as any other: prosperity, children, and peace. But as the drums of war grew louder, England was split by lines drawn not just on maps, but through hearts and households. In towns like theirs, neighbors became informants, and the question, "Which side are you on?" became a matter of life and death. John, convinced that the king's cause was just, began to host secret meetings in the cellar by candlelight. Royalist officers passing coded messages, planning uprisings, risking everything for a dream of England restored. Anne, meanwhile, heard the sermons of parliamentarian preachers in the church, urging the faithful to vigilance, warning that traitors and idolaters might be found even under one's own roof. The tension between Anne and John simmered for months, masked by forced politeness at the dinner table and late-night arguments behind closed doors. Their children, 2 daughters and a son, grew up in an atmosphere thick with suspicion, whispers, and anxiety. Outside, the war came closer. Soldiers camped in the fields, horses thundered past their windows. The local magistrate, a friend to Parliament, grew more powerful. Anne, desperate to keep her family safe, began to fear that John's secret would destroy them all. Then, late one night in 1645, everything changed. A parliamentarian patrol arrived in their village, searching for Royalist fugitives after a nearby skirmish. John went into hiding. He knew the penalty for harboring Royalists was death. Anne, suddenly alone, faced an impossible choice. Her husband's friends begged her to keep silent, to hide John until the danger passed. But Parliament had begun offering rewards for information, and the authorities warned that anyone found sheltering traitors would be punished along with them. For 3 days, Anne listened to the silence of her house, feeling it close in like a coffin. She watched her children, sensing their confusion and fear, and weighed her options with a desperation only those living under threat can understand. Loyalty to her husband meant risking the noose for all of them, perhaps losing her children to orphanhood and disgrace. Loyalty to her faith, her upbringing, and the law demanded she act, even if it broke her heart. On the 4th morning, Anne went to the magistrate. She confessed John's hiding place, a neighbor's barn, cold and dark, where he lay shivering and alone. The soldiers found him that evening. He did not resist. He looked at Anne once, a gaze that held every shared memory, every argument, every promise they had made. He said nothing as they led him away in chains. The next day, after a brief and brutal trial, John Evans was hanged as a traitor to Parliament. The village was divided in its reaction. Some saw Anne as a woman of courage, a patriot who put the cause above private feelings. Others whispered that she was unnatural, that no good wife would betray her own husband, no matter the cost. Her children, stunned by the suddenness of their father's death and the coldness of its delivery, turned away from their mother. They never forgave her. In their eyes, the bond of blood had been broken forever. But Anne's suffering did not end with John's execution. For the rest of her life, she carried the weight of her decision. The war ground on, and the world outside her door remained full of suspicion and accusation. But inside her own house, silence became her companion. Her children grew up, but the warmth that should have lingered between them was gone. She became a cautionary tale, a warning whispered to daughters of what loyalty, faith, and fear could do when tangled together. Some historians argue that Anne was not alone in her fate. Across England, the Civil War forced thousands of people, especially women, into impossible choices. Wives betrayed husbands, fathers denounced sons, brothers fought brothers, not out of malice, but because the war left no room for middle ground. Each decision was final. There were no appeals, no second chances. The law was clear, the punishment swift. In this world, Anne's act was both ordinary and extraordinary, a mirror to the larger tragedy of the war itself, in which families were shattered not just by cannon fire, but by the quiet, intimate betrayals of survival. And yet, in the quiet years that followed, Anne Evans was said to attend church every Sunday, sitting alone at the back, silent and unremarked. She prayed for forgiveness, but even she could not say whose forgiveness she needed most, her children's, her husband's, or her own. Her story lived on, not in official histories or triumphalist ballads, but in the hearts of those who feared what war could do to the bonds that matter most. The tale of Anne Evans reminds us that history is not made only by kings and generals, but by the choices of ordinary people in extraordinary times. It is easy to judge her, to call her either a heroine or a villain. But the truth is more complicated and far more human. She lived in a world where right and wrong were not written in stone, but changed with every shift in the wind. Her choice, terrible as it was the kind made by many who found themselves trapped between love and loyalty, fear and hope, the old world and the new. The English Civil War ended, the monarchy was restored, and the tides of politics shifted yet again. But for Anne Evans, and for the countless others who made impossible decisions in those years, there was no return to normal, no erasing of what had been done. She died with the knowledge that history rarely remembers the cost paid by the people who had to survive it. Hers is the story of a single choice, made in the darkness, echoing across generations, and still able to chill the heart centuries later. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the voices of all those families torn apart by the wars of their time, each one with their own Anne Evans, each forced to decide who they would save and what, in the end, they were willing to lose. When a father fought his son at Marston Moor, England, 1644. The wind tastes of gunpowder. Fields once green with wheat are now trampled by thousands of boots and horses, torn open by cannonballs and splattered with the fears and rage of a nation at war with itself. The Battle of Marston Moor is about to decide the fate of a country and the fate of a single family. Two armies face each other beneath a bruised July sky, Royalists in their plumes and sashes, parliamentarians in their plain, determined ranks. Fathers and sons, brothers and cousins, neighbors yesterday, now divided by colors and creeds they barely chose. The Civil War does not ask for permission. It finds your home, shatters your family, and makes the people you love into your most dangerous enemies. Among the Royalist cavalry, a seasoned officer steadies his charger. He is not young. His beard is streaked with gray, and his eyes carry the haunted look of a man who has watched his world collapse. He rides for the king because that's what his father did and his father before him. He tells himself loyalty is a virtue. He tells himself he must set an example for his household. But in the depth of his heart, there is a wound he will not admit to anyone, not even himself. For his eldest son, his pride, the boy he taught to ride and shoot, to read and pray, is somewhere in the parliamentarian ranks, fighting for Cromwell and the cause of Parliament, for a future the father cannot recognize. Nobody who has not stood on the edge of a civil war understands what it means to look across a battlefield and know your own flesh and blood is waiting with musket loaded, sword drawn, eyes searching for the enemy, and that the enemy might be you. Before the thunder of battle, there is silence, an ancient ritual silence that smells of sweat and mud and terror. Soldiers shift nervously, clutching tokens from home, whispering prayers. The Royalist father tries to push away the image of his son. He tells himself there are thousands of men here. What are the odds? But the heart is not a logical organ. A trumpet blares, orders are shouted. The ground shakes as the Royalist cavalry surges forward, horses pounding, sabers flashing, banners snapping like the heartbeat of war. Across the field, parliamentarian infantry brace themselves. Among them, the son feels the earth tremble. He remembers a time, not so long ago, when he and his father would race across these very fields, pretending to be knights. Now the game is real, and the winner will write history with blood. The Royalist father does not see his son at first. He is lost in the chaos, men falling, screaming, the world dissolving into smoke and terror. He leads the charge as he has been trained, thinking only of duty, honor, survival. He shouts commands, sees men fall beside him, feels the sting of grit in his eyes. His horse leaps over bodies, hooves slipping on the churned mud. Suddenly, through a gap in the parliamentarian line, he glimpses a familiar face, just for a heartbeat. The son, eyes wide with shock, raising his sword in self-defense. The moment is gone in an instant. There is no time for recognition or words. The father's cavalry crash into the infantry, steel meeting flesh with a sound that will haunt dreams forever. The son fights as he was taught, with skill and courage. The parliamentarian line bends, almost breaks, then surges back with desperate fury. In the crush, in the fog of battle, the father and son meet, blades crossing. In the confusion, the father does not recognize his opponent, not truly. War makes strangers out of kin. The son falls, struck down in the melee. Whether it was his father's blade or another's, no one will ever know for certain. The chaos swallows names and stories as quickly as it spills blood. After the rout, the field is a graveyard. The air is thick with the moans of the wounded and the stunned silence of those left standing. The Royalists are broken. The parliamentarian forces have won a decisive, devastating victory. The father searches the field, his soul numb. He finds bodies piled like discarded dolls, mud-caked in wounds, faces twisted in agony or frozen in peace. He is looking for something he cannot name, dreading what he might find. And then, there in the shattered remnants of the parliamentarian line, he sees the unmistakable shape of his son. The uniform is torn, the hair matted with blood, but the face is his own, years younger, unguarded in sleep. The father drops to his knees, his saber falls from his hand. The world shrinks to a single point of unbearable grief. It is said he cried out, a sound so raw that hardened soldiers wept to hear it. He cradled his son's body, rocking back and forth as if to soothe a feverish child. He whispered words from nursery rhymes, from prayers, from memories of another life. Around him the battle faded. Nothing mattered but this. In that moment, all the arguments, all the speeches, all the banners and politics were revealed as dust. There was only love, and the ruin war brings to love. Witnesses later said the father was never the same. His hair turned white. His voice grew soft. He could not bear to look at a sword or a uniform. Some say he left England, a ghost haunting foreign lands. Some say he returned home, silent and alone, his heart buried with his son at Marston Moor. This is not a story about victory or defeat. It is a story about the price war demands from those who fight it and those who love them. The English Civil War was not just a struggle for a crown or a parliament. It was a war that tore families in half, that made enemies out of fathers and sons, that forced men to choose between their country and their blood. The battlefields are long silent, but the pain remains in the soil, in the memory of every divided home. The father who fought his son at Marston Moor was not unique. There were thousands like him, in England and across the world, whenever brother turns against brother, whenever ideology becomes more powerful than kinship. But his grief, the moment when he held his fallen son, reminds us what is truly lost in every civil war. Not just lives, but futures, love, and the invisible threads that bind generations together. In the end, history will remember Marston Moor as a turning point. But for one family, it was the end of everything. The war that began for loyalty or for justice or for faith ended in silence, in a father's cry that echoed over the dead, over the land, over the centuries. And in that echo, we hear a warning, one that must never be forgotten: the family castle that became a war zone. There are places where history bleeds quietly into the stones, where centuries of ambition and fear settle into the walls. Until a single day comes when the past erupts and a home becomes a battlefield. Imagine Bolsover Castle, a grand Jacobean manor in Derbyshire, once a symbol of the Cavendish family's wealth, taste, and vision. On any other day, its towers might echo with laughter, the polished halls glittering in candlelight, tapestries shimmering as a gentle wind from the Peak District slipped through the windows. But in 1644, the world twisted. Suddenly, Bolsover was no longer just a family home. It was a prize, a fortress, and most painfully, a stage for the most personal kind of war, a war between kin, blood set against blood, all under the flag of civil war. The Cavendish family had built their reputation in an age of grandeur, and Bolsover Castle was the jewel. Sir Charles Cavendish, the patriarch, had overseen its transformation from medieval fortress to elegant manor. Here, in the years before war, his family and their relatives had feasted, danced, debated politics, and played at courtly games. Yet all the elegance in the world could not shield them from the gathering storm of the English Civil War. a conflict that would not respect stone, lineage, or loyalty. As the country split in two, Royalists loyal to King Charles I and parliamentarians seeking radical change, families everywhere were forced to choose sides. In houses up and down the land, dinner conversations turned to arguments and then to secrets. But for the Cavendish family, fate was more ruthless. Their castle itself would become the heart of the conflict. Sir Charles Cavendish himself was a staunch Royalist. His loyalty to the king was not simply political, it was a matter of honor, tradition, even identity. As Parliament's armies swept through Derbyshire, Bolsover's thick walls and high towers were suddenly invaluable. Royalist soldiers seized the castle, turning its grand rooms into makeshift barracks, its gardens into training grounds, its storerooms into arsenals. The ancient structure, once a sanctuary, was remade into a military stronghold. Portraits of ancestors looked down from the walls as musket racks lined the corridors. The kitchens, once filled with laughter and the scent of roasting meats, now boiled with the tension of war. Yet the Cavendish family was not united. Some members, by blood or by marriage, sided with Parliament. Old resentments and rivalries, usually hidden behind polite words, grew sharp in the heat of war. There were cousins who believed passionately in Parliament's vision of a New England, who saw the monarchy as a chain, not a crown. For them, Bolsover's occupation by Royalist kin was not just an insult, it was a challenge. And so, one day as the war swept north, parliamentarian forces gathered outside Bolsover Castle. Among them were Cavendishes by blood, distant cousins, old friends turned enemies, men who had once played as children in the shadow of those very towers. To attack Bolsover was not just a military objective, it was a betrayal, a heartbreak, and a reckoning with the past. As the parliamentarians prepared their assault, the castle's defenders, some family, some hired soldiers, braced for the siege. You have to imagine the emotion on both sides. Defenders peering over the battlements, recognizing faces among the attackers, attackers pausing at the memory of dinners shared, promises made, childhoods intertwined. The battle itself was both brutal and intimate. Cannon and musket fire tore through gardens where the Cavendish children once played. The air filled with smoke, shouts, and the crack of gunfire. There were moments recorded in letters and diaries where defenders and attackers recognized each other across the chaos. A cousin calling out another's name before raising his pistol, an old servant, now a soldier, hesitating as he saw the boy he'd once cradled, now leading the charge against his own ancestral home. These are the wounds of civil war that never heal. Each shot fired was not just a bullet at an enemy, but a blow against one's own memory, heritage, and blood. Inside Bolsover, panic and heartbreak mixed with the determination to hold the line. Rooms that once hosted poetry readings were barricaded with furniture. Family portraits were taken down, not to protect them from bullets, but to hide the faces of ancestors, because no one wanted to see their judgment in this moment. The fighting was desperate. Every inch of the castle was defended, each staircase, every window, the great hall itself. The parliamentarians pressed forward, using their knowledge of the castle's secret passages, hidden doors, and old childhood hiding spots. It was not just a siege. It was a dark parody of family life, every nook and cranny transformed from a place of joy into a battlefield. The siege lasted hours, but the psychological scars would last generations. Bolsover finally fell, battered and bloodied, but still standing. The parliamentarian relatives stormed through the halls. Some celebrated, others wept. For some, the victory was hollow. Winning the castle meant losing the family that once called it home. Letters from survivors speak of devastation. Rooms destroyed, gardens ruined, priceless heirlooms smashed or stolen. Worse than the physical destruction, however, was the emotional ruin. Brothers no longer spoke. Cousins disowned each other. Former friends became strangers, or worse, became bitter enemies. The Cavendish name, once spoken with pride, now echoed with pain, regret, and whispered accusation. And yet history did not stop. Bolsover Castle, like England itself, survived. The Cavendish family continued, battered but unbroken. In later years, they would try to restore what was lost, rebuilding rooms, replanting gardens, forgiving old grievances. But something fundamental had shifted. The castle's stones, once just silent witnesses to centuries of laughter and love, now remembered the day when kin fought kin, when loyalty and principle divided blood. To walk through Bolsover today is to feel that ghostly presence, the sense that the walls themselves carry memories of musket smoke, shouted orders, and the unspoken question, could you ever raise a sword against your own? This is the real tragedy of civil war. Battles between strangers can scar a nation, but battles between kin can tear the very soul of a people. For the Cavendish family and for England, the siege of Bolsover was not just another campaign. It was a lesson written in blood and stone, that sometimes the deepest wounds are not the ones we see, but the ones that echo through family, through memory, through home. The story of Bolsover Castle is not just a story about war. It's a story about the fragility of belonging, the pain of betrayal, and the way history can bend even the strongest bonds. Even after the cannons fell silent and the banners were taken down, the shadows lingered. In every rebuilt room there remained an absence, a silence where laughter used to be. In every family gathering there was the knowledge that the war had passed through their blood, leaving divisions that no apology could mend. And yet, out of the ashes, families rebuild. Bolsover Castle still stands, weathered and wise, bearing witness to the cost of conflict and to the impossible strength it takes to forgive. In the end, the Cavendish's story reminds us of a truth as old as history itself, that the greatest battles are not always fought for land or crown, but for the right to call a place home and to hold a family together, even as the world falls apart. The Puritan daughter who fled her family. Imagine England, 1644. The land is shrouded in smoke and fear. Everywhere you turn, families have been carved in two by invisible lines, parliamentarian and royalist, Puritan and Anglican, loyalty and rebellion. But in the Winthrop home, those lines were drawn straight through the heart. Elizabeth Winthrop, the youngest daughter, once belonged to the heart of a family famed for piety and order. Her father, a stern parliamentarian, built their world on certainty. Sermons in the candlelit dark, cold prayers at dawn, and the iron certainty that God's favor lay with Parliament's cause. In this house there were rules for everything, how to think, how to speak, even how to feel. But war does not recognize rules. War shatters the illusion of safety. War comes into your house and sits down at your table. As England's civil war raged outside, inside the Winthrop home, the real battle was for the soul of a daughter. Elizabeth was never like her siblings. Where they saw duty, she saw confinement. Where they prayed for Parliament's triumph, she heard only the drumbeat of boots and the hunger of the fields. She watched the men of her village, fathers and sons, march off to die beneath banners they barely understood. She saw her father's friends whisper about spies, about neighbors who were suddenly enemies, about churches burned for a prayer spoken in the wrong accent. And somewhere deep inside, something broke away. The letters between Elizabeth and her father still survive. They start as gentle, anxious inquiries, her father asking why she lingers by the windows, why she has grown silent, why her friends now visit only in the dead of night. But soon the tone changes. Accusation replaces concern. He accuses her of harboring Royalist sympathies, of listening to seditious sermons, of longing for the old songs and the old freedoms that the Puritans had banished. Elizabeth, for her part, writes back with a trembling defiance, "I am still your daughter, but my soul is my own." The words ring with the fear and courage of someone who knows she is being watched even as she writes. Outside, the war grows more brutal. Parliamentarian soldiers storm through the countryside, rooting out Royalist strongholds, burning homes, hanging traitors from the village trees. Elizabeth sees the toll up close. Starving children, widows clutching the last letters from their husbands, churches echoing with desperate prayers for peace. In the Puritan household, no one is allowed to speak of suffering. The war is painted as righteous, every loss a necessary sacrifice. But Elizabeth cannot accept it. In the secret places of her mind, She begins to question everything: the sermons, the hatred, even the love she is supposed to feel for her own blood. One winter night, as the wind howls through the empty fields, Elizabeth makes her choice. She packs a small bag, nothing more than a change of clothes, a worn prayer book, and a lock of her mother's hair. She leaves behind everything else: the warmth of the kitchen, the safety of her childhood bed, even her name. She flees into the night, guided only by rumors of a Royalist camp in the hills. The journey is agony, every shadow a potential captor, every sound a warning. Yet she presses on, drawn not by political theory, but by the raw, unkillable instinct for freedom. When she reaches the Royalist encampment, Elizabeth is not welcomed as a hero. She is regarded with suspicion, interrogated, her motives questioned. What if she is a spy? What if this is a trap? But over time she proves herself. She nurses the wounded, cooks for the soldiers, and learns the secret code words that bind together this desperate, ragged band of exiles. For the first time she hears laughter again, real, unguarded laughter, not the brittle, forced smiles of Puritan duty. She witnesses a different kind of faith, one not enforced by threats, but kindled by shared suffering and the hope that someday the world might be healed. Back at home, the news of her flight falls like a funeral bell. Her father is shattered. In a letter that survives to this day, he writes, "The war has swallowed her heart. She is lost to us." The pain is sharp and total, grief tangled with fury, love curdled by the taste of betrayal. He disowns her, erasing her name from family records, refusing to let her be spoken of even in whispers. For him, Elizabeth is dead. For Elizabeth, the death is real, but it is not hers. It is the death of the child she once was, the obedient daughter who could not breathe the air of war. But war has a way of exposing truths that peacetime can bury. As months become years, the battle lines shift, and so do the stories people tell about themselves. Elizabeth becomes a legend in the Royalist camp, a symbol of lost innocence, of the price families pay for politics. Her old life haunts her, but she never looks back. She learns to live with the ache of exile, with the knowledge that her rebellion cost her everything but her soul. The tragedy of Elizabeth Winthrop is not simply that she ran from her family. It is that the world she left behind, the world of Puritan certainty, of black and white faith, could never have contained the vast, untamed landscape of her heart. She chose exile over obedience, loneliness over the comfort of belonging to the wrong side. And in doing so, she exposed the secret that every civil war tries to hide. That sometimes the deepest wounds are not inflicted by bullets or blades, but by the people who once called you daughter. Decades later, long after the war's dust had settled, whispers of Elizabeth's fate drifted back to her old home. Some say she survived the war, married a Royalist officer, and built a new life in the North, far from the judgment of her father's God. Others claim she died in obscurity, her grave unmarked, her story forgotten. But among the Royalist survivors, and in the brittle pages of letters hidden for centuries, the truth endures. Elizabeth Winthrop was not just a casualty of war, but a survivor of her own making. Her father's words, "The war has swallowed her heart," were not a curse, but an unintended blessing. For in being swallowed by war, Elizabeth became something her family could never imagine, free, at last, to choose her own destiny, no matter the price. The lesson of her life is not one of triumph or tragedy, but of the impossible choices that war demands. In a time when every path leads to loss, when every act of loyalty is also an act of betrayal, Elizabeth Winthrop's story is a silent scream echoing down the centuries, a warning and a hope for anyone who has ever been asked to choose between the love of their family and the truth of their own soul. The child forced to spy on his uncle. He was only 10 years old, but on that day the world of Thomas changed forever. In the shadowed corners of the English Civil War, a conflict where family ties shattered as quickly as the stained glass of village chapels. A child could become a weapon, a pawn, or worse, a betrayer. Thomas, with his wide, trusting eyes and his two small shoes, became both. His story, real and raw, unfolds in the bleak intersection where innocence collides with political calculation, and the cost is measured not only in blood, but in scars carried for a lifetime. The parliamentarian soldiers first noticed Thomas at a family gathering. He was clever, sharp-eyed, and, crucially, unsuspected by the adults. In those desperate years, neither Royalists nor parliamentarians hesitated to use whatever means they could to gain advantage. Espionage had become a dark art, and children, with their natural invisibility and loyalty, were the perfect instruments. Thomas's uncle was a known Royalist sympathizer, harboring fugitives, sheltering wounded cavaliers, quietly funding the king's men. He was careful, secretive, and suspicious of every outsider, but he trusted his nephew. That, as history has too often shown, is where tragedy begins. The soldiers took Thomas aside, promising him protection, perhaps even small rewards, but beneath the surface lay the ever-present threat. They told him that the fate of England rested on his courage. They whispered to him that true bravery meant choosing the greater good, even if it meant hurting someone you loved. For a boy raised on Bible stories of sacrifice and honor, the argument made a kind of cruel sense. At first, Thomas resisted. He tried to warn his uncle with half-spoken hints, with frightened glances, with the stubborn silence of a child who has been told too much. But the pressure only grew. Soon the soldiers demanded details. Who visited the house? What messages passed between rooms? Where was the hidden cellar? The parliamentarians had no time for patience, and Thomas's world shrank until all he could hear was the drumbeat of their demands. One evening, under the guise of a child's curiosity, Thomas watched as his uncle opened the secret panel behind the hearth. He saw the coded letter, the pistol, the Royalist badge. His small heart hammered in his chest. The next morning, the soldiers returned, faces masked with false smiles. They knelt to his level, offered him bread and a kind word. Then they pressed him, gently at first, then more forcefully. The choice they gave him was no choice at all. To refuse was to risk his own family's safety, to invite suspicion, perhaps even violence. To comply was to betray the only man who had ever treated him with fatherly kindness. So Thomas told them. He gave away the hiding place, described the visitors, revealed the secret panel and the signs he'd seen. The soldiers nodded, satisfied. Later that night, the parliamentarians raided the house. The uncle was taken in chains, his face a mask of disbelief and heartbreak. He had time only for a single glance at Thomas, one that would haunt the boy for the rest of his life. In that glance was everything: shock, betrayal, love, and an unbearable sense of doom. The trial was swift. In wartime, justice is a formality, and Royalist sympathizers were shown little mercy. Thomas's uncle was executed, accused of treason against Parliament. News spread quickly through the village. Some neighbors spat on the ground when Thomas walked by. Others pitied him, recognizing the depth of his loss and the horror of his guilt. His mother wept quietly at night, unable to comfort her son or herself. In the decades that followed, Thomas would revisit that moment in dreams. The secret panel, the words forced from his lips, his uncle's final look. The trauma shaped him. In a world that often celebrates child heroes and the supposed purity of youthful sacrifice, Thomas's story is a bleak reminder that the scars of war are sometimes deepest in those least able to bear them. He grew up with the constant ache of guilt, replaying his choices and wondering if things could have been different. He became, in many ways, a ghost in his own life, never truly able to forgive himself or believe that others could. The parliamentarians, for their part, quickly forgot the boy after his usefulness had ended. The war moved on, with new battles, new betrayals, and new victims. But Thomas never moved on. The war may have ended, but the battle inside him did not. Every time he heard the church bells, every time he passed the now abandoned house where his uncle once lived, he felt the weight of history pressing down. He was a child forced to choose between loyalty and survival, between family and fear. The world expected him to grow, to forget, to live. But some wounds do not heal with time. Some betrayals echo forever. Through Thomas's eyes, we see not just the political upheaval of the English Civil War, but the intimate tragedy it visited upon families, on the most vulnerable of all. His story stands as a warning from history that the greatest cost of conflict is not always paid on the battlefield, but in the quiet, shattered hearts of those who are forced to become something they were never meant to be. The boy who was used as a spy never truly returned from that war. The world remembers the victories and defeats. But for Thomas, history was not written in triumph or loss. It was written in grief, in guilt, and in the silent, lifelong trauma that followed him wherever he went. And so the story of Thomas endures, an unsettling, unforgettable reminder of how the machinery of war can turn even the smallest hands into instruments of destruction, leaving no one, not even a child, untouched by its cruelty. The woman who defended her home against her own cousin. In the midst of the English Civil War, a time when allegiances were shifting, neighbors watched one another with suspicion, and the land itself seemed divided. There lived a 16-year-old girl named Sarah Mallory. Her story is one of fierce conviction and tragic loss, not on the grand scale of kings and armies, but within the tight-knit boundaries of a small English town. It is a story that reveals what it truly meant to choose a side when neutrality was impossible, and to pay the price not in blood on the battlefield, but in the quiet devastation of banishment, shame, and the betrayal of lifelong bonds. Sarah Mallory had grown up surrounded by familiar faces, her childhood shaped by the rhythms of village life, the tolling church bells, the gossip in the market square, the laughter of friends who knew every story her family had ever told. Her father, a loyal supporter of King Charles I, had quietly instilled in her a sense of duty to the crown, a loyalty that Sarah absorbed as easily as breathing. In a house where the Bible and the royal crest sat side by side, she learned to equate faith with loyalty and honor with obedience to the king. The Civil War, when it reached her town, was not some distant rumor. It was an existential threat, a storm on the horizon, and Sarah met it not with fear, but with certainty. She knew where her heart belonged. As the parliamentarian army marched ever closer, the mood in the town began to shift. Fear crept into every household, and old friendships began to fracture beneath the weight of suspicion. One by one, families declared their allegiance, not always publicly, but in whispered conversations and furtive gestures. Sarah's family, like many Royalist households, became increasingly isolated, their neighbors wary and their former friends hesitant to visit. But Sarah refused to hide her beliefs. She wore her Royalist badge openly, spoke of the king with admiration, and even sang Royalist songs in the fields, her voice clear, stubborn, unafraid. To some, her courage was inspiring. To others, it was reckless, a challenge to the new order rising around them. As parliamentarian forces seized control of the region, the pressure to conform grew unbearable. Town meetings were now attended by soldiers, and every word spoken was a potential accusation. In this climate, Sarah's open support for the king was seen not just as dissent, but as betrayal. The breaking point came on a cold morning just after the parliamentarians established their garrison in the market square. The town elders, now eager to prove their loyalty to the new authorities, called a public meeting. Sarah was summoned, her name called out by people who had once cradled her as a baby and watched her grow. In the center of the square, surrounded by neighbors, friends, and even distant cousins, Sarah stood as the accusations were read aloud, that she had sung Royalist songs, spoken against Parliament, and refused to renounce her loyalty to the king. At 16, Sarah was younger than many who would be judged in these troubled times, but her courage did not falter. She stood tall, refusing to apologize or beg for mercy. The crowd, emboldened by the presence of soldiers, jeered and shouted. Old friends turned their faces away. Some cried, some spat at her feet. A sense of ritual humiliation filled the air. Sarah was forced to wear a placard around her neck, declaring her a traitor to Parliament, and paraded through the streets where she had once played as a child. The walk felt endless, every step driving home the reality of her exile, every shout and whispered insult reminding her that she was utterly alone. That day, Sarah Mallory was formally exiled from her town. The sentence was absolute. She was not to return on pain of imprisonment, and anyone found helping her would face the same fate. With only a small bundle of belongings and the memory of her childhood home fading behind her, Sarah was forced to walk away, her future uncertain and her heart shattered. The roads beyond the village were dangerous, filled with soldiers, bandits, and the ever-present threat of hunger. But Sarah had no choice. The world she had known was gone, replaced by a harsh new reality. In exile, Sarah became one of many, thousands of refugees, royalist and parliamentarian alike, wandering a fractured country in search of safety and a sense of belonging. Some found shelter with distant relatives or sympathetic households. Others disappeared into the chaos, their names lost to history. For Sarah, each day was a struggle to survive, but she clung to her convictions with the same stubbornness that had made her an outcast. Stories tell of her traveling from village to village, offering what labor she could, sometimes finding kindness, sometimes only suspicion and further rejection. But she never recanted. She wore her loyalty like a second skin, even as it cost her everything she had ever known. The tragedy of Sarah Mallory is not only that she was banished, but that she was banished by people who had once loved her. In the years after the war, as old wounds began to heal and some semblance of peace returned, her story lingered like a scar in the memory of her hometown. Some who had jeered her in the square lived to regret their actions, haunted by guilt and the knowledge that fear, not justice, had ruled that day. Others hardened their hearts, insisting that such measures were necessary to survive the war. Sarah's fate remains uncertain. History does not record whether she ever returned or what became of her after exile. But her story, preserved in letters and in the whispered memories of those who witnessed her fall, serves as a testament to the personal costs of civil war. It reminds us that loyalty is not just a word, but a force that can both uplift and destroy, that even the strongest convictions may come at a devastating price. In every civil conflict, there are thousands of Sarah Mallorys, young, idealistic, punished for the courage of their beliefs. Their stories may never appear in the official histories, but they live on in the silence of lost homes, in the faces of those left behind, and in the quiet roads where exiles walk alone. And when we speak of war, of nations divided, we should remember that the greatest wounds are not always those left by sword or musket, but by the betrayal of the familiar, the shattering of community, and the loss of innocence forever. The Royalist who refused to kill his brother. It is the summer of 1644, and the English countryside is no longer defined by peace or by the steady rhythm of the harvest. Instead, it is carved into territories, Royalist redoubts, and parliamentarian strongholds, each one trembling under the threat of sudden violence. The English Civil War has become a war not of distant armies, but of neighbor against neighbor, and most painfully, brother against brother. Among the Royalist cavalry rides Colonel Henry Dutton, a soldier not by choice, but by heritage. a man driven by the heavy weight of expectation and family honor. The war has made him a figure of respect among his peers, his loyalty to the king unquestioned, his courage on the field proven many times over. Yet there is a torment inside him that no medal, no salute, no order from a superior can quiet. For across the battle lines, dressed in parliamentarian colors, is his own brother, the boy he grew up with, the man who now stands as his enemy by the cruel geometry of fate. They were born in the same house, their childhoods a tapestry of laughter, rivalry, and shared secrets. They learned to ride ponies on the same farm, chased each other through the same meadows, played at swords and shields before they ever dreamed such games would become real. Their parents watched them grow, believing that blood was a bond stronger than any political storm. But history has no regard for the sanctity of kinship. As the country fractured, so did families. One brother found hope in the promise of Parliament, the idea that old tyrannies could be swept away, that justice could belong to every man. The other clung to the traditions of loyalty and order, believing that the king's cause was righteous and that England would perish if its ancient roots were torn up. These were not just ideas, they were destinies. And in 1644, destinies collided on a field of mud and horror. Henry Dutton's regiment was tasked with a crucial assault, an attack meant to shatter the parliamentarian defense and turn the tide of the campaign. The night before the battle, Dutton could not sleep. He sat in his tent, the candle flickering, his hands shaking as he read the last letter his mother had sent, reminding him of childhood promises and the unbreakable bond of brotherhood. The letter felt like a relic from another world, a world where brothers might argue but never point muskets at each other's hearts. But orders were orders, and dawn would bring war. As the sun bled through the morning mist, Dutton mounted his horse, eyes burning with exhaustion and dread. His soldiers looked to him for courage, but he felt nothing except the drumbeat of fate. The two armies faced each other, lines bristling with pikes, the air taut with anticipation. As the charge began, the ground shook with the fury of hoofbeats and shouts, musket fire cracking like thunder all around. Dutton led his men forward, saber raised, every sense sharpened by fear and duty. And then, in the chaos, a familiar face. There, across the battlefield, stood his brother. Older now, harder, but unmistakable. For a moment the years vanished. Dutton remembered wrestling in the hayloft, arguing over who would inherit their father's watch, the way their mother's voice would soften when she called them both in for supper. Now, with only a few paces between them, fate demanded a final, terrible act. One brother must kill the other, or be forever haunted by the memory of this moment. The orders were clear. The logic of war demanded action. The men around Dutton fired their pistols, swung their swords. The world contracted to a single, silent choice. Dutton raised his weapon, stared into his brother's eyes, and saw not an enemy, but the mirror of his own soul. The Royalist paused, heart pounding so violently he thought it might burst. His brother's musket was aimed, but hesitated, just as Dutton hesitated. The chaos of battle raged around them, but in this tiny island of stillness, history held its breath. Dutton lowered his pistol. He could not fire. The thought of spilling his brother's blood, of returning home with that stain on his soul, was too much. Even as his men yelled at him to act, even as the tide of battle swept onward, he stood motionless, paralyzed by mercy, by memory, by love. In that instant, Dutton's entire world collapsed. He knew what it meant. The army does not forgive disobedience. The king's cause could not pause for the heartache of a single officer, but he chose the agony of disgrace over the finality of fratricide. In refusing to kill his brother, Dutton lost everything else he had fought to protect. The parliamentarian line held. The Royalist attack faltered. Dutton was pulled from his horse by his own men, accused of cowardice, insubordination, and even treason. He stood before his superiors, no longer the hero of earlier battles, but a ruined man, haunted, silent, unrepentant. He would not defend himself. There was nothing to say. His commission was stripped. His reputation turned to dust. Friends turned away, unable to look him in the eye. Some whispered that he had been bewitched, others that he was a secret parliamentarian sympathizer. But the truth was simpler and infinitely sadder. In a war where loyalty was measured in blood, Dutton chose mercy, and mercy made him a traitor to his own side. The news reached his family. His mother wept for the son who had come home broken, and for the son who would never look at his brother the same way again. Dutton wandered the countryside, a man without a banner, his only company the memories of childhood and the knowledge that he had saved a life, but lost his own place in the world. Some said he disappeared into the anonymity of exile. Others said he became a doctor, healing wounds instead of making them, determined to redeem himself through quiet acts of kindness. The brother he spared survived the war, but carried the invisible scar of that day forever, knowing that his own life had cost his brother everything. England healed eventually, but the Dutton brothers never truly did. Their story faded from official histories, eclipsed by tales of glory and victory, but whispered still in the villages and hamlets of their youth. It is a reminder that the truest acts of courage are often invisible, that the greatest wounds do not bleed, and that the deepest form of sacrifice is not dying for what you believe, but living with the cost of mercy. In the end, Colonel Henry Dutton's legacy was not carved on a monument or honored by parades. It was written in the quiet refusal to become an executioner of his own blood, and in the shattered silence that follows when love and loyalty are forced to fight on opposite sides. When wars are over, flags are folded, and songs are sung for heroes who killed and conquered. But somewhere, in the silence of old houses and empty fields, the ghosts of those who refused, those who could not raise their weapons against their own, linger on. They are the secret saints of civil wars, the men and women who chose to lose everything rather than betray the oldest bonds. Henry Dutton's story, rarely told but never quite forgotten, is not just a tale of war. It is a lesson in the cost of keeping one's soul intact when the world has gone mad. The children left in a burned village. There are moments in history when silence says more than words ever could. Imagine the quiet that falls over a village after fire has consumed everything, the choking stench of ash lingering in the air, the blackened skeletons of cottages standing crooked against the sky, and somewhere, hidden beneath broken floorboards, the smallest survivors shivering in a darkness deeper than night. This is not the story of great generals or famous kings. This is the story of Brampton, a village set aflame by the roaring tide of civil war, and of the children left behind whose only crime was being too young to run. The English Civil War was a war of fathers and sons, of ancient loyalties and revolutionary hopes, but its shadow did not stop at the walls of castles or the halls of Parliament. It swept over the countryside, touching the most ordinary lives with extraordinary cruelty. In the spring of 1644, Brampton was just another village, tucked into the folds of the English landscape. Its people lived close to the land. Children played in muddy lanes, chickens scratched in the dust, and the days passed in a rhythm that seemed timeless, until war arrived with the suddenness of a thunderclap. On a cold morning, parliamentarian soldiers rode in, strangers with hard faces and sharper weapons, men for whom mercy had become a distant memory. Brampton had no garrison, no fortifications. Its defenders were old men, boys barely grown, mothers clutching infants, all powerless to halt the crimson advance. The soldiers came to make an example, suspecting the village of sheltering Royalist sympathizers, or perhaps simply because they could. It is easy in the swirl of history to forget the faces of those who suffer. But in Brampton, every life was marked by the day the world changed forever. They set fire to the thatch, and flames leapt greedily from roof to roof, swallowing dreams in their hunger. Shouts turned to screams. Chickens and cattle panicked in the chaos. Mothers gathered children and tried to flee, but the village's narrow lanes became traps. Some villagers were driven into the fields, but not all escaped. There were those too slow, too old, too scared, left behind as the flames closed in. And then there were the children who, in the terror of the raid, found themselves separated from everyone they knew and loved. When the soldiers moved on, the air was thick with the sickly sweet scent of smoke and the sound of distant weeping. The once living heart of Brampton was reduced to charcoal and ruin. The days that followed were a kind of limbo, a place between worlds, where hope was as fragile as the blackened beams that still stood. And then, in the eerie silence, a group of villagers searching for survivors made a discovery that would haunt their memories for the rest of their days. In the half-collapsed shell of a cottage near the village center, an old man heard a faint scratching. At first he thought it was a rat or maybe a stray dog searching for scraps. But as he pulled away charred planks and shifted scorched debris, he saw small fingers gripping the floorboards from beneath. The boards lifted slowly, hesitantly, and out of the darkness emerged the pale, dirt-streaked faces of children. Their eyes were too wide, their lips pressed together in a silence so profound it was almost holy. These were the ones who had hidden when the soldiers came, the ones who had heard the shouts, smelled the smoke, and somehow survived. There were 3, maybe 4 children. No one was certain in the confusion, for some would never speak of it again. The oldest could not have been more than 8. The youngest, still in rags, clung to her brother with a grip that refused to let go. In the days of chaos, their parents had died in the flames or in the fields. These children had crawled beneath the floorboards, drawn by a desperate animal instinct to vanish from the world above. There, in the dark, they waited. They waited as the fires raged, as the soldiers shouted and laughed, as the village around them was destroyed. They waited as silence fell, so deep and absolute that it seemed the whole world had ended. When they were found, the children could not speak, not because they had nothing to say, but because terror had taken their voices. Their throats were raw from smoke and fear. Their eyes darted from face to face, searching for something familiar, some scrap of the world they once knew. The villagers who found them wept openly. These were not strangers, but children whose parents they had known, whose laughter they had heard in the lanes, whose futures had once seemed as certain as sunrise. Now they sat in the ruins, mute as stones. The story of those days spread quickly, carried on the wind by rumor and sorrow. Some said the children had gone mad. Others believed that they had been touched by God or by something darker. What everyone agreed was that they were changed. The trauma of war had marked them in ways no one could see. Some would never speak again. Others would talk only in whispers, as if afraid the sound of their own voice might summon the soldiers back. Brampton was not unique. All across England, villages like it were torn apart, burned, left to mourn in silence. But the image of those children, huddled under the floorboards, caught between fire and darkness, lingered. In the years that followed, as survivors rebuilt what they could, the children became symbols of both loss and endurance. They grew in time, but never quite shed the shadows that the war had left inside them. Some were taken in by distant relatives or kind neighbors, but none ever truly forgot what it was to be alone beneath the world, listening to the sound of everything you love being destroyed. In a war that boasted of noble causes and grand ideals, the fate of Brampton's children was a truth too painful to name. They were not heroes or villains. They were simply survivors, small and silent, carrying in their bodies the memory of fire, fear, and the terrible cost of other people's quarrels. History books often pass over their names, but in the hidden places of every ruined village, their story is written in ash and tears. As you listen to this story, remember that the scars of war are not only measured by fallen soldiers or broken crowns, but by the quiet suffering of the smallest and most innocent. The children of Brampton did not choose their fate. The world above chose for them. And in their silence we hear the deepest echo of every war, that the greatest tragedies are not always seen on the battlefield, but are carried home in the hearts of those left behind. The family Bible that saved no one. In a country drowning in chaos, there stood a single battered stone house on the outskirts of a nameless English village. For generations, the old family Bible sat open on a wooden table, its pages yellowed and soft from the touch of countless hands. This Bible was more than scripture. It was the living record of a family's entire existence. Every birth was written here, every marriage, every trembling moment of hope, and every shattering moment of loss. It was the only inheritance that mattered, binding the living to the dead through ink, paper, and the desperate faith that someone was listening. But then the world broke apart. It started slowly with distant rumors of war, parliamentarian against royalist, brother against brother, fathers against sons. And soon that ancient Bible became something darker, a ledger of heartbreak, a tally of the doomed. It began with a single entry. A son, conscripted to fight for a cause he barely understood, vanished into the mud of Marston Moor. His mother wrote his name with shaking hands, the ink blurring as her tears fell on the page. She left a space beside his name, clinging to the hope he might return, that someday she could write the word home next to his memory. But the space remained empty, a wound that never healed. As the seasons turned, the list of names grew longer. A daughter, lost to fever after tending wounded soldiers in a makeshift field hospital. A father, accused of hiding Royalist fugitives, dragged away in the night and never seen again. Two brothers last glimpsed on opposite sides of the same battlefield, their fates sealed by colors on their coats instead of blood in their veins. Each time the door slammed or the wind howled down the chimney, the surviving family would gather around the Bible, praying not for victory, but for the mercy of survival. And every time another loved one vanished into the jaws of war, someone would take up the quill and add another name to the endless, unmerciful roll call. The Bible became a diary of desperation. On one page, a child's hand had scribbled, "Father, come home." On another, a wife had written, "Remember us." Margins filled with pleas, bargains with God, desperate bargains. "If only you spare him, I will forgive every sin." But the war was deaf. No prayers could halt the march of armies. No ink could resurrect the dead. Sometimes neighbors would seek shelter in the house, driven by hope that the family's reputation for piety might protect them. But war knows no sanctuary. Soldiers barged in, searching for food, for weapons, for enemies, for the smallest spark of rebellion. They tore apart cupboards, scattered ashes on the floor, and trampled the words of forgiveness that had been spoken in the dim candlelight of the parlor. The family's faith was battered but never broken, not until the winter of 1645. Starvation crept through the doors like a silent thief. The last surviving daughter wasted away, her prayers growing fainter each night. The mother, once so fierce and full of fire, now trembled with the weight of unspoken grief. She had buried husband, children, cousins, neighbors, each time returning to the Bible, each time believing that writing the names would somehow keep their spirits close. That memory could substitute for touch. The last entry in the Bible was made on a night when hope had all but vanished. Snow battered the windows, and the family gathered by candlelight. What was left of them? They prayed together, voices thin and fractured, more habit than hope. The mother dipped her pen in ink for the final time. Her hand shook so badly she could barely form the words. But she managed to write, "We prayed together, then perished apart." The candle guttered and died. In the weeks that followed, the house fell silent. Neighbors whispered about the curse of war, about the Bible whose prayers went unanswered, about a God who seemed absent in the face of such relentless sorrow. Soldiers eventually found the house empty, only the Bible left behind, as evidence that a family had ever existed within those walls. They read the entries in silence, a few muttering prayers of their own, before moving on to the next abandoned home. Years later, that family Bible was discovered by a traveling minister hidden under a loose floorboard. He carried it with him, the pages heavy with the names of the dead, and showed it to anyone willing to listen. He would run his finger down the list, each name a life snuffed out by the endless hunger of war. He would linger on the final entry. We prayed together, then perished apart. It was a confession, a testament, and a prophecy all at once. What does it mean for faith to survive when nothing else does? What does it mean when the only thing left of an entire family is a record of their prayers and their loss? The Bible that saved no one is not just a story of failure, but a warning, a map of the landscape of grief that war leaves behind. It reminds us that faith cannot always protect us from the world's violence. Sometimes, faith is the only thing left to write down when everything else has been torn away. This is how families are remembered, not in triumph or glory, but in the quiet desperation of ink on paper, in the stubborn act of recording names no one else will remember, in the hope that someday someone will read and understand that once they prayed together, even as the world tore them apart. The husband who returned home to find strangers. He left his home a loyal parliamentarian, believing he was fighting for a better England, and above all, to protect his family's future. Years passed on the fields of battle, each one marked by the endless drum of conflict, the ache of separation, and the desperate hope that one day he would return to the small cottage where laughter once echoed beneath the thatched roof. Through rain-soaked marches, sleepless nights, and the constant specter of death, he clung to the vision of home, the soft warmth of his wife's hand, the high, clear voices of his children at play, the comfort of belonging to a world untouched by war's chaos. But in the English Civil War, nothing remained untouched. At last the fighting faded. Parliament's banners rose over broken towns, and survivors limped home to what they hoped was peace. For this man, every step toward his village felt like a step toward resurrection. He imagined the moment of reunion, a door flung open, arms thrown around him, children racing through the gate, his wife's face illuminated with relief and pride. Instead, what greeted him was silence and the cold, unfamiliar stares of strangers. The path he remembered as a ribbon of childhood joy was now overgrown and neglected. The hedgerows had changed, as if the land itself had aged in his absence. He hesitated before the cottage, his heart pounding with hope and dread. The door opened, not by his wife, but by a man he had never seen. Behind the stranger stood his wife, dressed in Royalist blue, her hair pinned in a style he didn't recognize, her face hardened by years he hadn't shared. His children peered around her, eyes wide, seeing not a father returned from glory, but an unshaven, ragged intruder. In those frozen seconds, the full devastation of civil war became heartbreakingly clear. His wife stepped forward, not with joy, but with apprehension. There were no tears, no loving embrace. Instead, there was confusion and guilt. While he had marched under the parliamentarian cause, she had been left alone in a country that changed beneath her feet. Neighbors had vanished, old friends betrayed one another, and the lines between right and wrong were rewritten with every fresh skirmish. Isolation and fear became her only companions. When Royalist soldiers came, demanding loyalty and support, she faced impossible choices. Survival for herself and her children became paramount. The only way forward was to align with the victors of the moment, a marriage to a Royalist officer whose power brought protection but no love. As the parliamentarian soldier looked at his wife, now someone else's, and at the children who shrank away from his touch, a silent grief twisted inside him. Years had passed. His youngest child clung to the Royalist stepfather, calling him Papa, while the older one stared, unable to reconcile faded memories with the hollow-eyed man before him. He tried to speak words of explanation, of longing, of forgiveness, but no words could bridge the abyss that war had carved between them. He was a survivor, but survival came at the price of identity. In his own home he was a stranger, no longer husband nor father, but a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that had moved on without him. The law offered no comfort. Property, marriage, and even memory had been rewritten by politics and necessity. There was no place for him, not in the bed he once shared, nor at the hearth where his stories once lived. The war had not just changed him, it had erased him. The village, too, was different. Old allies looked away, fearing guilt by association. Neighbors whispered about loyalty and betrayal, about which side had suffered most. Some pitied him, others quietly resented his return. He wandered the lanes searching for familiarity, but found only the bitter fruit of conflict, divided loyalties, broken promises, the quiet ruin of ordinary lives. The world he returned to demanded new allegiances, new faces. His own past became a liability, his sacrifices unrecognized, his suffering irrelevant. In the years that followed, the parliamentarian veteran drifted from village to village, a living reminder of the war's most intimate cruelty. He was a man unmoored from his own history, haunted by memories of love and laughter that now belonged to someone else. Sometimes, late at night, he watched his former home from a distance, candles flickering through the window, the faint sound of children's laughter on the air. He realized the war had taken not just years, but the very fabric of his being. He had returned, but there was nowhere left for him to return to. This was the hidden cost of civil war, a cost not counted in the ledgers of generals or the speeches of kings. It was measured instead in the silence of broken homes, the hollow ache of recognition gone unreturned, the strange permanent exile inflicted on those who fought for a future that no longer existed. His story, like so many, was quietly buried beneath the rubble of history. Yet it endures, in the haunted footsteps of every soldier who comes home to find that home itself has vanished, replaced by the cold gaze of strangers where love once lived. The English Civil War was not only fought on battlefields, but in kitchens and bedrooms, in memories and in dreams, where the wounds of absence and betrayal never truly heal. The war ended, the loss did not, and so his story lingers, a warning, a lament, a truth too often forgotten when the drums of war begin to beat. The Royalist girl, banished by her town. In the small, tightly woven villages of 17th century England, community was everything. Generations were layered in memory, every street was familiar, and every face was known since childhood. For Sarah Mallory, a 16-year-old girl born to Royalist loyalty, this community was the fabric of her identity. Her family's support for King Charles I wasn't a matter of politics, it was tradition, faith, and the anchor of their lives. The English Civil War, as it swept the nation, turned those anchors into chains, and the very things that had once made her proud soon became the source of her suffering. Sarah's father had served the king's household as a steward before the war began, and in their modest home the stories of royal service were told as bedtime tales. Her mother embroidered the king's cipher on linens. The local vicar, a friend to her family, often prayed for the king by name, even as it became more dangerous to do so. Sarah herself was spirited, outspoken, and fiercely attached to the ideals of loyalty and honor. She wore a faded blue ribbon, once a sign of Royalist hope, pinned to her bodice, and defended the king's cause in every market argument, never hiding where her heart stood. But when parliamentarian troops finally marched into her town, the world Sarah knew began to unravel. It wasn't just the soldiers with their harsh demands and unfamiliar banners that changed things. It was the sudden, chilling realization that the boundaries between neighbor and enemy had dissolved. The local council, eager to appease the new powers, turned on those who had once been friends. Accusations flew faster than musket balls, houses were searched, oaths of loyalty demanded, and every family was forced to declare itself. Sarah was warned, quietly at first, by those who cared for her. "Hide your ribbon, speak softly, don't draw attention." But for Sarah, silence felt like betrayal. She refused to recant, even as Royalist sympathizers were rounded up, questioned, and sometimes imprisoned. She kept her head high as others averted their eyes in the street, the same people who once handed her sweets or invited her to dances. Even her closest friends grew distant, afraid that being seen with her might draw suspicion onto their own families. The day of her undoing came suddenly, but the threat had been building like a storm for weeks. On the morning the parliamentarians declared martial law, the town square was filled, not just with soldiers, but with the townspeople themselves. A new loyalty oath was read aloud, and one by one the villagers stepped forward to recite it. When Sarah's name was called, a hush fell. She stood, trembling but defiant, refusing to speak the words that would betray her beliefs. Her refusal was seen as open rebellion. A murmur rose among the crowd, at first confusion, then anger. The local council declared that her actions endangered the peace and reputation of the entire town. The soldiers, eager to set an example, demanded that she be publicly punished for her defiance. In a ritual of humiliation meant to break her spirit, Sarah was forced to stand in the center of the square as the townsfolk gathered. She was stripped of her ribbon, and a placard was hung around her neck branding her a traitor to Parliament. Some of the older women wept quietly, but no one intervened. What made the ordeal even more brutal was that it wasn't just the soldiers enacting this punishment. It was neighbors, friends, even distant relatives, compelled by fear or duty or the simple urge to protect themselves. One by one, those who had watched her grow up turned their backs, unwilling or unable to show her kindness. The parliamentarians pronounced her sentence, exile. She was to be banished from her home, never to return on pain of imprisonment. Anyone who aided her would face the same fate. Sarah was given only a few minutes to gather her belongings. As she walked out of the town gate, a few children, her former playmates, watched silently, confusion and sadness etched on their faces. The streets, once filled with the sound of her laughter, now echoed with emptiness. Her parents, powerless to save her without condemning the rest of the family, stood in their doorway, hearts shattered. No goodbyes could be said without risk. On the road alone, Sarah entered a world marked by uncertainty and fear. The countryside was filled with others displaced by the same brutal logic. Men and women exiled for their beliefs, for words spoken in the wrong company, or for refusing to denounce their own families. Sarah's youth made her especially vulnerable. She faced the dangers of hunger, exposure, and the predatory gaze of the lawless or the desperate. Yet she carried with her an unbroken spirit, her loyalty to the king now transformed from a public badge to a private act of faith. For weeks Sarah wandered from village to village, seeking work, shelter, or even a kind word. Sometimes she was met with suspicion, other times with small acts of compassion from those who recognized the pain of war in her eyes. She heard stories of others like herself, families split, children lost, communities divided beyond repair. Her own suffering was part of a much larger tragedy. Across England, the Civil War had made exiles of thousands and broken the bonds that had held villages together for generations. Yet even in exile, Sarah never renounced her beliefs. Letters later discovered, written in her careful hand to cousins in distant towns, spoke of her longing for home, for her family, and for the peaceful days before the war. She never blamed those who had turned against her. Instead, she mourned the loss of trust and the cruelty that fear could breed. Her story became a quiet legend among those who remembered her, the girl who stood alone, shamed and exiled, but never bowed. History does not record what became of Sarah Mallory in the end. She might have found refuge with the distant kin or vanished into the anonymous tides of the displaced. But her story survives, passed down as a warning and a tribute to the cost of war, not just in lives lost on the battlefield, but in hearts broken, friendships destroyed, and the silent suffering of the innocent. Her exile is a reminder that, in times of conflict, the lines drawn by politics and armies are less lasting than those etched in memory by shame, betrayal, and the courage to stand alone when everything is at stake. The English Civil War eventually ended, but for Sarah and others like her, the wounds remained. To this day, her story lingers in the silent spaces of small towns, where history is not just a matter of kings and parliaments, but of the girls and boys who were forced to choose and pay a price no one should ever have to face. The letter that destroyed a family. There are moments in history when a single piece of paper, marked by hurried, trembling handwriting, becomes more dangerous than a sword, more final than any bullet. In England's Civil War, trust was the first casualty, and every message became a potential death sentence. The war between king and parliament was fought not only in open fields, but in shadowed corridors, behind closed doors, within the privacy of homes suddenly turned into battlegrounds of loyalty and suspicion. In this world, a letter, meant only for a brother's eyes, could become the weapon that tears a family apart forever. The family in question had long been divided by the conflict. The elder brother, resolute and proud, had thrown his allegiance behind the Royalist cause. He believed in the sanctity of the monarchy, the old ways, the divine right of kings. His younger brother, equally stubborn but more restless, had drifted towards Parliament, seduced by the idea that a new order might bring justice to those left voiceless by tradition. Yet even as their allegiances divided, their hearts had not. Blood is thicker than politics, or so they thought. In the dark corners of their world, where even walls seemed to listen, the two brothers continued to write to each other in secret, letters that carried the weight of hope, guilt, and the desperate longing to bridge a widening chasm. One letter, written late at night in the elder brother's own hand, was filled with the vulnerable honesty that only family can draw out. He wrote of his fears for the future, his doubts about the war, his longing for the days before all of England was sick with suspicion. He asked after their mother's health, after their childhood home, and pleaded that one day they would be able to meet again as brothers, not enemies. The words were simple, full of the yearning and confusion that only someone living through a civil war can understand. But the world had changed. Secrets could not be trusted to the wind, and a single slip, a careless courier, a moment of bad luck, delivered the letter into the hands of the enemy. It was intercepted by parliamentarian agents, men trained to read between every line, to see treason in even the most tender sentiment. The letter was not just evidence of contact between enemies, it was proof, they claimed, of conspiracy. A sign that the Royalist brother was not only fighting for the king, but plotting with parliamentarian traitors. The reality was far more human, far more tragic, two brothers trying, against every force of their shattered world, to remain brothers. But in the atmosphere of fear and suspicion, no one wanted to hear the truth. The letter became a weapon. The elder brother was arrested at dawn, dragged from his bed before he could even dress. The soldiers were cold, efficient, immune to his protests. They showed him the letter, watched his face pale, listened to his desperate explanations, none of which mattered now. In a time when fear ruled justice, guilt was decided before the trial ever began. The letter, once a fragile lifeline, now became a noose. In the makeshift court, the evidence was read aloud, words of longing twisted into accusations of treachery. The brother refused to betray his sibling, even as his fate became clear. He stood in the dock, proud, silent, refusing to give Parliament the satisfaction of seeing him break. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was public, a warning to all who might let family loyalty outshine political allegiance. He died with his brother's name on his lips, but he would not reveal his hiding place, would not damn his kin to the same fate. The crowd was silent. Even those who believed in the parliamentarian cause could not watch a man hanged for loving his brother without some secret part of themselves recoiling in horror. His mother, already broken by years of fear, could not bear to see her son's body brought home. The home they had once shared became a place of ghosts and silence. The younger brother, learning of the execution, was shattered. Guilt and terror fused into a single, relentless agony. He understood what must come next. There was no hope of pardon, no chance to clear his name. The letter, his own words, twisted and used as a blade, had condemned him too. He went into hiding, forced to change his name, to live in shadows and back rooms, trusting no one. Each day was a new exile, every knock at the door a new panic. He fled from city to city, carrying only the memory of his brother's last words, the knowledge that his own hand had, without intent, sent his blood to the gallows. He never saw his family again. The grief became a second skin, invisible but ever present. His mother's letters were never opened. The sound of his father's voice faded to a memory. He lived out his days as a stranger, a man whose home had become a memory that cut deeper than any wound. The house where they had played as boys was abandoned, choked by weeds, the laughter of childhood replaced by the wind's mourning. No one ever spoke of the letter. Its memory was too dangerous, too painful, a wound that never healed. In the end, the war ground on, and then was done, as all wars eventually are. New men took power, new laws were made, but the real cost of the conflict was not tallied in the ledgers of Parliament or the proclamations of kings. It was measured in families destroyed, in lives unspooled by fear, in the silence left behind by letters that should never have been read by anyone but those who loved each other most. The story of the two brothers is only one among thousands, a reminder that, in the end, it is not banners or politics that survive, but the scars we leave on each other. There are no monuments to a letter, no songs for the pain it brings. But in the quiet spaces of England, among the ruins of old houses and the faded ink of forgotten words, the story of a single intercepted message lives on. It is a warning, a lesson that the words we write in love can be twisted into our doom, that trust is a fragile, sacred thing, and that, in war, even the gentlest gesture can become a curse. The brothers are gone, their family destroyed. Only the story remains, passed down as a shadowy reminder of what is truly lost when a nation turns on itself. Not only life, but hope, and the precious, irreplaceable bonds of family. The family that divided its land. Along party lines, picture an English estate in Derbyshire not as a single home, but as a living map of heartbreak, a place where loyalty was measured not by words, but by walls, fences, and invisible lines drawn across fields that once belonged to a single family. Imagine a manor house standing at the edge of civil war, two brothers inside, both flesh and blood, each staring at the other across a chasm wider than any river. They were born to the same father, raised by the same mother, played beneath the same ancient trees, yet as England split in two, so did they. And as the world outside caught fire, they did the unthinkable. They divided everything they owned, not just for themselves, but for rival armies fighting for the soul of a nation. This is not a legend nor a poetic invention. It is the story of two brothers in Derbyshire whose estate became a battlefield without armies, whose home became a borderland between ideologies. The older brother, stern and unyielding, gave his loyalty to the king, a royalist by inheritance, believing the order of the crown was the order of the world itself. The younger, restless and impassioned, believed in Parliament, fired by visions of liberty, justice, and a country ruled by reason, not by birthright. Both were men of conviction, but conviction can be a curse. It turns the heart to stone, narrows the eye, makes enemies of brothers. When the war erupted in 1642, their debates, once confined to late-night arguments over port and roast meat, became a matter of life and death. The estate was vast, stitched together by generations. It included fields, woods, barns, and the great house itself, a symbol of the family's history. But when the country divided, so did they. They walked the land together in cold silence, drawing an invisible line from hedge to tree, from gate to stream. One side, fields to the west, half the barns, and the old dovecote, would be held for the Royalist cause. The other, fields to the east, the orchard and the newer granaries, would be offered to parliamentarian soldiers. Even the manor itself was split, brick by brick, room by room. The older brother took the west wing, filling it with Royalist flags and loyal retainers. The younger seized the east, draping Parliament's colors over the carved oak doors. Where laughter once echoed through the halls, now there was only the anxious silence of divided hearts. Soldiers arrived, each loyal to one side or the other, and the estate became a patchwork of uniforms and accents. The kitchen, once a warm, boisterous heart, became a checkpoint. Meals were no longer shared, but rationed and guarded. Children, if any were left, learned to speak in whispers, to stay on their side of the garden. At night, candlelight flickered in both wings, casting long shadows against windows, now blackened for fear of snipers or spies. Out in the fields, horses stamped and men drilled, sometimes catching glimpses of rivals through the mist, realizing that the enemy was family. There are stories, fragments handed down through letters and bitter memory, of midnight confrontations in the halls, where brothers met not as kin but as adversaries, each trying to hold the center of a world that was collapsing. There are tales of servants forced to pick sides, of old retainers who tried to act as go-betweens, risking their lives to carry messages across the dividing line, and always the estate, once a symbol of unity, became the clearest proof that war did not just shatter nations, but families. Seasons passed. The Civil War raged on. Each brother watched as his side lost men, horses, and hope. The land, once fertile, grew trampled under soldiers' boots, the fields left untended as crops failed and fences fell. Letters from neighbors and relatives went unanswered. In the village, people whispered that the family had gone mad, that God himself would never forgive a house so divided. And then, at war's end, there was no peace, only reckoning. Parliament's victory did not bring healing. It brought fear, retribution, and for many, the desire to erase the shame of the past. Some say the brothers tried to reconcile. Others claim the bitterness ran too deep. What is certain is this: the estate, the great house that had stood for centuries, was consumed by fire from within. Perhaps it was vengeance, a spark set by one side or the other, a last act of spite by soldiers unwilling to share even the ashes. Perhaps it was an accident, the inevitable result of chaos and mistrust. Flames rose in the night, licking through corridors, devouring portraits, tapestries, and letters, everything that might have explained, forgiven, or remembered. Neighbors came running, but the blaze was unstoppable. The brothers, it is said, stood apart in the yard, illuminated by the fire that destroyed all they had ever known. Some say they wept. Others claim they turned away from each other, unable to meet the other's eyes. The house crackled and collapsed, sending sparks into the black sky, as if the land itself mourned what had been lost. In the aftermath, the brothers were left with nothing but scorched earth and bitter memory. The estate, once a living testament to family and tradition, became a ruin, a warning to all who saw it of the cost of division. The land, so carefully measured and divided, was now useless to both. No Royalist or Parliamentarian flag flew there. The only banner was smoke, drifting over empty fields, carrying with it the ghostly echo of voices that had once filled those halls with love, anger, and hope. This is not a story with heroes or villains. It is a story of conviction pushed to the edge, of family torn asunder by beliefs so powerful they became more important than blood. The fire that consumed the house did not just destroy wood and stone. It erased the shared past, the possibility of reconciliation, the hope that one day laughter might return. For generations, locals would walk past the blackened ruins and remember the brothers who drew a line not just through their land, but through their own hearts. The lesson of the divided house is one that endures. When we draw boundaries out of hate or pride, when we forget the ties that bind us, we risk losing everything. The flames that burned in Derbyshire were not just a product of war. They were born of all the words left unsaid, all the forgiveness withheld, all the love that was sacrificed to the altar of ideology. The greatest loss was not the house or the land or the wealth, but the very thing that made them brothers in the first place. So, as you imagine those Derbyshire fields, remember that sometimes the fiercest battles are not fought with swords, but with silence. The deepest wounds are not seen on the skin, but felt in the soul. And the cost of division is not just what we lose today, but what we can never rebuild tomorrow. The mother who buried her sons in different uniforms, beneath a sky forever bruised by smoke, In a countryside once stitched together by quiet villages and harvest songs, the Dalton home became a private battlefield, a place where war was not a rumor but a force that tore through every room, leaving nothing untouched. Margaret Dalton was once a woman known for her laughter, for the warmth that radiated from her kitchen, and for the iron certainty with which she held her family together. But war has a way of unmaking certainties. It turns laughter brittle and memories into ghosts. In the winter of 1643, as the English Civil War raged, Margaret became the witness and the victim of the greatest cruelty a mother can endure, the burial of both her sons, each in a uniform meant to kill the other. It was not supposed to be this way. The Daltons had been a family of modest means, neither wealthy enough to buy safety nor obscure enough to escape notice. The father, long dead from fever, had left Margaret with two sons, William and Thomas, who were the light and the future of her world. They grew up side by side, sometimes fighting, sometimes laughing, always sharing the secrets that only brothers can. Yet, when the world split into Royalist and Parliamentarian, so too did the Dalton brothers. William the elder, drawn to the songs and splendor of the King's men, put on the Royalist red and marched south. Thomas, his heart set on reform and the words of Parliament, donned the dull gray of Cromwell's army and rode north. No argument, no plea, could bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Each believed he fought for England's future, each convinced the other was lost. For Margaret, every letter, every rumor was agony. She prayed for peace, begged her sons to come home, wrote to them again and again, sometimes angry, sometimes desperate, sometimes simply pleading, "Survive." When battles raged nearby, she would walk the roads, eyes raw from sleepless nights, searching the faces of passing soldiers for a glimpse of her sons. But war is not kind to mothers. The world moved on, uncaring, and the two brothers vanished into the tides of history, until history spat them back out at her feet. It happened in the space of a single week, a week that shattered Margaret's mind and heart forever. First came the news from Marston Moor. William, fighting in Royalist red, had fallen in the mud and blood of the battlefield. His body was returned by a stranger, a gravedigger who'd found his name stitched inside his coat. Margaret buried her eldest in the churchyard, the Royalist sash draped across his still chest, her own tears baptizing the earth as the villagers gathered in uneasy silence. Some whispered that Royalist dead deserved no Christian burial, but Margaret would not be moved. "He is my son," she said, her voice stronger than her shaking hands, "and I will lay him to rest as a mother should." Barely had the grave soil settled when the second blow fell. Days later, a parliamentarian officer arrived at her door, hat in hand, face drawn with the knowledge of the errand he must perform. Thomas, her youngest, had been cut down in a skirmish not 5 miles from where his brother died. Margaret's knees buckled. This time it was the dull gray coat she folded around her child's broken body. Again the villagers gathered, uncertain, muttering about divided loyalties and curses, but none dared defy a mother's grief. Margaret herself dug the grave, clawing at the frozen earth until her fingers bled, because no one else could touch what was left of her world. 2 sons, 2 uniforms, 2 fresh graves standing side by side, symbols of a country torn in two, with a mother left to mourn both halves. After that, Margaret Dalton was never seen the same way again. Some say she sat beside the graves through every rain and snow, whispering to the earth as if her sons might still hear her. Others recall seeing her wandering the lanes at night, clutching a tattered red sash in one hand and a scrap of gray cloth in the other, singing lullabies to the empty fields. The village priest claimed she spoke to shadows and birds, told stories to anyone who'd listen about boys who once played beneath the yew trees. The truth is that Margaret had gone somewhere the rest of the world could not follow, a place beyond words, beyond comfort, where the past replayed itself in endless, unbearable loops. Neighbors pitied her, some feared her, but all understood that hers was a sorrow the war could not mend. The Dalton house, once alive with the noise of boys and the warmth of family, grew silent and cold. The kitchen hearth went out, the garden turned to weeds. Sometimes passing children would say they saw Margaret speaking to the wind, naming her sons as if calling them home. Years passed, but the pain did not soften. The war ended, armies vanished, but the Dalton graves remained. 2 mounds of earth, one draped in red, the other in gray, side by side in the churchyard. Margaret herself faded from this world, her mind unraveling in slow, invisible agony. But the story did not vanish. Long after Margaret's death, villagers would tell her tale in hushed tones. The mother who buried her sons in different uniforms, the woman who lost her sanity, not to violence, but to the slow, corrosive ache of grief. They said she wandered the churchyard at night, searching for the children she could never bring back, and that sometimes, when the wind blew just right, you could hear her singing their names. Her sorrow became a kind of legend, a warning, a prayer, a reminder of what Civil War truly means. Because the English Civil War was not only fought on muddy fields or behind stone walls, it was fought inside homes, inside hearts, between brothers, inside the trembling hands of a mother forced to choose love over politics and lose everything anyway. Margaret Dalton's story is the story of 1,000 families, lives sundered by belief, by fear, by colors and causes they did not choose. Hers is the grief that lingers long after gunpowder has faded, after banners have rotted in the rain. In the end, there was no victory for Margaret, only memory and madness, only graves and the silence that follows. This is the hidden cost of war, not the numbers in history books, but the faces behind each name, the mother whose heart was broken by uniforms, the brothers lost to each other, the village forever haunted by what it could not save. Margaret Dalton did not die for a king or a cause. She died slowly for love. And that is the story the world must never forget. The priest torn between sons. In the heart of England, where hedgerows divided ancient fields and church bells once called neighbors together, a small village tried desperately to survive the tides of the Civil War. At its center stood a priest whose voice had soothed the dying united lovers and taught children their first prayers. He was not a man of politics but of faith, someone who believed that, above all, a father's duty was to love without condition, and a shepherd's calling was to protect every soul, no matter which flag they saluted. But in the age of cavaliers and roundheads, even the gentlest neutrality became a crime. This priest's dilemma was deeper than most. His own sons, his flesh and blood, had been claimed by opposite sides. The elder, swept up in the fiery charisma of the king's men, rode to war as a proud cavalier, his hair long, his armor bright, convinced he fought for God and tradition. The younger, thoughtful and stern, wore Parliament's colors, believing England's freedom required the shattering of old chains. Each son begged their father for a blessing before leaving, searching in his eyes for approval, for reassurance, for a sign that they carried righteousness into battle. But the priest's hands, so steady at the altar, trembled when he tried to choose between them. How does a father look at 2 sons ready to kill and die for ideas he cannot reconcile? How does a man of God pray for victory when victory means the defeat or death of his own child? The village watched in tense silence as the priest walked the line between love and loyalty, his heart breaking with every letter from the front. Some parishioners urged him to declare for one side or the other. The war, they said, left no room for fence-sitters. Others admired his stubborn devotion to peace, but even they knew it couldn't last. The world around him grew harsher. News of nearby battles arrived like black clouds, skirmishes, sackings, rumors of atrocity. Soldiers from both armies passed through the village. Some paused for prayer. Others demanded to know which side the priest served. He answered always the same. His allegiance was to God and to the souls of his flock, not to the ambitions of men. He refused to bless either banner, refused to preach hatred from his pulpit, refused to use holy water as a weapon or his prayers as propaganda. But neutrality in a country at war with itself is easily mistaken for treason. As his sons fought, the priest endured a different war at home, a war of whispers, threats, and silent judgments. Some villagers accused him of cowardice, others of hidden sympathies for the enemy. He wept in the quiet hours of the night, praying not for triumph, but for the safe return of both his boys, for the soul of a nation tearing itself apart, for the strength to do no harm. He tried to write to his sons, sending words of love instead of slogans, hoping to remind them that, in some places, family still mattered more than politics. Then came the inevitable reckoning. A parliamentarian commander arrived, suspicious of all who refused to declare loyalty. The priest's refusal to denounce the king, nor to endorse Parliament, was called seditious neutrality. He was dragged before the village, his sermons questioned, his loyalty doubted. He could have saved himself with a single word, a public prayer for one side's victory. Instead, he spoke of the futility of brothers killing brothers, of the pain that no victory could heal, of the God who mourned every lost son, no matter the color of his sash. For this he was stripped of his parish, expelled from the only home he had ever known. His congregation stood divided, some silently weeping, others cold with righteous anger. The priest left the church he had served for decades, carrying only his battered Bible and a heart heavy with guilt, sorrow, and a stubborn, unyielding hope that someday his sons would find their way back to each other and to him. His story faded into the background of a country obsessed with battles and politics, but it lingered in the memories of those who witnessed his quiet resistance. His sons survived the war, barely, each carrying wounds visible and invisible. It was many years before they saw their father again, old and stooped, but still refusing to speak hatred, still refusing to choose between his children. The priest's life became legend, a warning and an example. In a world that demands sides, there is courage, too, in refusing to turn love into a weapon. His seditious neutrality was, in truth, the last act of a true shepherd, one who would rather be cast out than bless the bloodshed of his own sons. His voice echoes still, a whisper in the ruins of that village, urging us to remember that sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply refusing to hate. The cousins who became executioner and condemned. In the shadowed streets of Civil War London, where every alley whispered secrets and each household nursed its own loyalties, the boundary between family and enemy could blur until it vanished entirely. The English Civil War was a conflict that turned kin against kin, forced the unthinkable on the unwilling, and demanded choices that would scar souls for lifetimes. Nowhere is this agony more clear than in the story of two cousins, one in parliamentarian uniform, one condemned as a Royalist traitor, whose fate collided at the very threshold of life and death. Their story begins not on the battlefield but in childhood. Edward and James grew up together, their families entwined by blood and memory, summer afternoons spent chasing each other through London's tangled lanes, laughter echoing off stone walls. Their fathers, brothers themselves, had watched the boys bond with pride, certain that nothing could shatter such a closeness. Yet as they grew, London itself grew restive. The city became a place of watchful eyes and whispered rumors, of pamphlets passed in candlelit rooms and soldiers patrolling the bridges. As the English Civil War deepened, families were forced to choose sides. For some, loyalty was a matter of faith. For others, it was survival. Edward, drawn to the reformist zeal of Parliament, believed passionately in the cause. He rose quickly, his intelligence and determination earning him an officer's commission. He told himself it was the only way to protect his city, and perhaps one day bring England to peace. James, by contrast, was a Royalist by temperament and tradition, steadfast in his support of King Charles I. He believed the old order was sacred and that the king's authority was ordained by God. As the war ground on, their paths diverged. Correspondence became rare, then ceased altogether. Each cousin heard of the other only in passing, one's name spoken in parliamentarian circles as a rising officer, the other rumored to be fighting with the king's desperate forces. Fate, though, had not finished with them. In 1648, After the tide of war had turned sharply against the king, James was captured in a failed Royalist uprising in London. He was accused of treason against Parliament, a charge that carried only one penalty. The city buzzed with news of the arrests. Families mourned, and old alliances were remembered with both pride and terror. Edward, now an officer responsible for order in the city, received an order from his superiors that chilled his blood. He was to supervise the execution of a condemned Royalist and to ensure the law was carried out with proper ceremony. When he read the name on the list, his hands trembled. It was James, his cousin, his childhood companion, now condemned as an enemy. The law in wartime was pitiless, and refusal was not an option. Edward spent a night without sleep, haunted by memories. Two boys racing across a moonlit courtyard, hands joined in a pact of eternal loyalty. He thought of their mothers, once inseparable, now separated by suspicion and sorrow. The city outside his window seemed to press in, as if all of London was holding its breath. Edward knew that if he refused his orders, he too would face disgrace, or worse, the gallows. But to obey would be to betray blood, memory, and every promise he'd ever made. The morning of the execution dawned gray and cold. The scaffold had been built in the shadow of the tower, crowds already gathering, hungry for justice or vengeance, or perhaps just spectacle. Edward stood at the edge of the platform, his uniform immaculate, his face a mask of duty. James was led forward, pale but unbroken, his eyes searching the crowd until they settled on his cousin. For a long moment neither spoke. There was no chance for private words, no space for explanation or apology. Everything that needed to be said hung between them, unspoken and unbearably heavy. Edward signaled the start of the ceremony. His hands were steady, his voice did not break. Yet as the chaplain read the final prayers and James bowed his head, tears began to course down Edward's face. They streamed unchecked as the executioner stepped forward, as the sentence was carried out, and as the crowd watched in uneasy silence. The officer's grief was unmistakable, visible even to those at the farthest edge of the square. Some whispered that such displays were unmanly. Others saw in it the true cost of civil war. Oh, when it was over, Edward removed his hat and stood motionless, tears still shining on his cheeks. He did not speak as the crowd dispersed, nor did he join his fellow officers at the tavern that evening. The city swallowed the event, as it had so many other tragedies, but among those who witnessed it, the image lingered, the parliamentarian officer who wept as he condemned his own kin. Edward was never the same. For weeks he wandered the streets of London at night, unable to find peace. Those who knew him noticed the change, a gentleness, a sadness, an understanding that obedience and justice are sometimes at war within the soul. He wrote no letters to his family. James's mother, upon hearing how her son had died, is said to have wept not only for her child, but for her nephew, forced by law to play executioner in a war neither had chosen. The story of Edward and James endures not because it is unique, but because it is emblematic of the wounds the English Civil War left across the fabric of a nation. It is a reminder that the real cost of conflict is not counted in victories or defeats, but in the families torn apart, the friendships shattered, and the hearts forced to harden in the name of duty. There were many like them, brothers, fathers, sons, cousins, set against each other by forces larger than themselves. Each time the pain was fresh and the tears just as bitter. In the centuries since, historians have chronicled the great battles, the sweeping political changes, and the rise and fall of kings. But in the quiet corners of old London, stories like that of Edward and James are still told, of cousins who became executioner and condemned, and of a single moment on a scaffold when all the rules of war and family collided. Their story survives not as a footnote, but as a warning, that in civil war there are no true victors, only those who must live with what they have done and with what they have lost. The family portrait that was split in two. In England, the past lingers in oil and canvas. Every grand manor held at least one family portrait, a tapestry of faces painted together, generation upon generation, fixed in brushstrokes. bearing silent witness to feasts, sorrows, and the steady march of time. These portraits were never just images. They were maps of love and duty, of all that held a family together, even as the outside world fractured and storms of politics gathered over green, rolling hills. But during the English Civil War, even the most intimate anchors of family could be torn apart. Loyalties split not only parliaments and kings, but homes and hearts. For one prominent family, the portrait in their great hall was the centerpiece of their world, a towering oil painting nearly as wide as the fireplace itself, showing the parents at the center, children arrayed on either side, a symbol of unity, prosperity, and belonging. It was a living record, each face captured at its brightest, their future still unwritten. But as Parliament and royalty called their banners, the family splintered. The eldest daughter, sharp-minded and iron-willed, believed England must change. She joined the parliamentarian cause, trading pearls for plain cloth, feasts for fasting, and the safety of her ancestral home for a new city, new friends, new principles. Her brother, the eldest son, could not bear it. He clung to tradition, to the king, to the memory of hunting parties and Christmases when the house was full. He led the Royalist defense of their estate with the same pride he once used to organize family games. The war that followed was not just a war of armies. It was a war of words, of glances, of letters that started warmly but grew cold, each one edged with the ache of betrayal. The portrait in the hall became a source of anguish, a reminder not only of the love that had once been, but of what had been lost. When the house was seized and the family forced to choose sides, they gathered for the last time beneath the painting, faces pale with grief, their unity a memory painted in oil, even as real life tore it apart. Years passed. The war raged, then subsided. England would never be the same, and neither would this family. The estate, battered by soldiers, was no longer the home it had been. The siblings, once inseparable, lived on opposite sides of a chasm that no letter could cross. It was then that the painting became more than a memory. It became a battlefield. Arguments erupted. Who would keep it? Who deserved it? Who could bear to look at it now that half the faces belonged to strangers? In the end, they could not agree. The daughter, living in a cold northern town, missed her childhood and all that had been lost. The brother, haunted by the empty corridors of their ruined home, could not forgive her for abandoning what he saw as duty. The portrait itself seemed to echo their pain, the canvas too vast for any wall, the faces too many for any one room. So the unthinkable happened. The painting was laid on the great table, the one where birthdays and weddings had once been celebrated. A local craftsman, silent and sorrowful, was called to do the deed. With careful hands he took a sharp knife and sliced the canvas from top to bottom, separating daughter from brother, the parliamentarian from the royalist, hope from memory. The family watched in silence. No one spoke, no one wept. It was the war, played out in pigment and cloth. The daughter carried her half away, rolled tight, packed with the few treasures she had managed to save. In her new house, far from the old halls, she hung the painting in a narrow parlor. The faces stared out, her mother, herself, two younger sisters. But the other side of the frame was raw, unfinished, a reminder of everything cut away. She would trace the jagged edge with her fingers, remembering the laughter and fights, the whispered secrets before sleep, the brother who had been her first friend and fiercest rival. She wrote letters sometimes, though she never sent them. The brother kept his half in the ruined manor, now cold and mostly empty. His father's face watched over him, stern and proud. The edges of the canvas curled and yellowed. Some nights, after too much wine, he would sit before the painting and speak aloud to the empty half, imagining what his sister might say, or how the room would look if they had never gone to war. Visitors to the house noticed the strange artwork, a family cut in two, and whispered about the old days, about how the war had split even the noblest households. The siblings never spoke again, neither forgave and neither forgot. Decades slipped by. The brothers' children, raised on stories of loyalty and betrayal, never met their aunt. The daughter, childless, grew old in her new town, surrounded by strangers who could not understand why a faded painting brought her to tears. Sometimes she would dream of the great hall, whole again, fire blazing, laughter echoing beneath the painted faces. In the dreams, the portrait was always untouched, the family together, the war just a story that would never come true. Long after both had died, their separate halves of the painting survived, two relics of a wound that had never healed. Each half was a mirror to the other's loss, a record not just of a family, but of an entire country torn down the middle. New generations would discover the portraits, puzzle over the jagged edge, and ask, what happened here? The answer was written not in history books, but in the silence between the two halves, in the longing that haunts every family torn apart by forces beyond their control. The English Civil War is remembered for its battles and politics, but its deepest scars were carved in the hearts of those who lost their homes, their kin, and their place in the world. In the end, it is not kings or parliaments that linger in memory, but the portrait on the wall, the silence in the hall, the faces turned forever away from one another. The child who didn't know which side killed his father. Some wounds in history never quite close. Some questions, born in violence, echo for a lifetime, unanswered and unanswerable. The English Civil War was a conflict that splintered families and shattered certainty. For some, its aftermath was a matter of treaties or titles. But for one child, just 7 years old, the war would become a silent shadow, stretching behind him into every year of his life as he searched in vain for the truth about the day his father died. It began on a dawn like any other, somewhere in the countryside where the earth was rich and the air still smelled of last night's rain. The boy's father was a farmer, a quiet man who knew the rhythms of the soil and the names of every animal in the fields. Their life was humble, built on simple things, honest work, warm bread, stories by candlelight. But England in the 1640s was no place for innocence. War had crept into every hedgerow, turning neighbors into spies and the countryside into a chessboard of hidden dangers. The boy had heard gunfire before, distant and thunderous. But on this day it was closer. So close it rattled the glass and shook the birds from the trees. His father, like many caught between armies, had no uniform, no allegiance beyond survival. But war does not always give you a choice. Early that morning, skirmishers passed through, muskets glinting and banners flickering red and blue in the mist. Some wore Royalist sashes, others the plain steel of Parliament's new model army. They moved fast, driven by orders and fear, their voices harsh in accents the boy didn't recognize. When the battle began, it was sudden, chaotic. The family cowered in their cottage, clutching each other as the sound of shots and shouts tore the air. Windows shattered. A bullet buried itself in the old oak door. Somewhere outside, his father called for everyone to stay down. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the noise faded. The soldiers, whoever they were, melted into the trees, leaving behind only ruin, the burnt tang of gunpowder, and a silence so deep it felt like a spell. It was the boy who ventured out first, stepping barefoot into the dawn. The fields were scarred, torn by boots and hooves. Chickens scattered at his approach, and the earth was pocked with black marks. The boy's father was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, hope flared. Perhaps he had fled. Perhaps he was hiding, waiting for the danger to pass. But then the boy saw a shape sprawled among the wheat, where the green stalks bent awkwardly in a way that was not natural. He ran to him. The man lay face down, blood staining the earth, hands still curled as if clutching invisible tools. The boy knelt beside him, calling his name, but there was no answer. Only the indifferent breeze and the far-off caw of crows. The farm, once alive with promise, was now a graveyard of questions. The boy searched his father's body for wounds, for clues, for something to anchor his grief to a fact, a name, an explanation. But there was only the finality of death and a wound that could have been made by any musket, fired by any hand. Neighbors came to help. They shook their heads, muttered about the battle, and tried to comfort the family with the rituals of loss. But when the boy asked, "Who did this?" no one could say. The skirmishers had worn no clear insignia. Some villagers said they were Royalists, fleeing a parliamentarian patrol. Others whispered the reverse. The battle had passed in a blur. Loyalty, like uniforms, was muddied by the rain. There were no witnesses who could tell the boy which side had killed his father. No officer would come to explain. No record would be kept. Days turned to weeks, and the war moved on. The boy's world shrank to the patch of land where his father's shadow used to fall. He watched the other men return from the fields, some Royalist, some parliamentarian, most simply tired. He listened for gossip in the market, hoping for a scrap of truth. But the only certainty was loss and the unending ache of the unknown. At night he dreamed of soldiers, faces blurred, voices muffled, raising muskets in the half-light. Sometimes, in the dreams, he tried to stop them. Sometimes he tried to choose a side, but always woke before the shot was fired. His family did what they could to survive. They patched the cottage, planted the fields, and tried to forget the sight of their patriarch lying cold in the dawn. But for the boy, forgetting was impossible. The field where his father died became a forbidden place, haunted not by ghosts, but by questions. As he grew, he learned the names of battles, the dates of treaties, the speeches of men who claimed to know right from wrong. But he never learned the name of the man who had ended his childhood. He never knew if his father's last sight was a familiar face or a stranger's, whether the shot was meant for a soldier or for the land itself. Years passed. The war ended, replaced by an uneasy peace. The country stitched itself together, but the boy carried the tear inside him. As a man, he tried to forgive, tried to believe that such wounds belonged to history, not to the living. But when asked about the war, he would only say, "My father died in it. I do not know who killed him." Some wounds heal over, but the mystery remained raw, a knot at the center of his life. He learned in time that this was the fate of many children in civil war, to be left with fragments, with half-truths and rumors, with the burden of memory untempered by knowledge. Some say he grew angry, others that he became gentle, understanding too well the randomness of violence. But he never chose a side, never marched beneath a banner, never let himself be comforted by the simple clarity of enemies and friends. The world moved on, but in one field, one morning, the cost of war was measured not by territory gained or lost, but by a child kneeling beside a father, haunted for a lifetime by a question that history would never answer. And so, as you listen, remember, sometimes the sharpest pain is not what we lose, but what we are never allowed to know. For that boy, the war never truly ended. It lived on in the silence between the questions and the answers that never came. The farm that changed floods 5 times. In the rolling green fields of Essex there once stood a small farm whose fate became the story of England itself, torn, battered, claimed and reclaimed, until finally it vanished into silence. For generations, the Turner family worked the same patch of land, coaxing wheat and barley from the heavy soil, raising sheep and children in equal measure. The world outside changed with the passing of kings, but their farm was a constant. Stone walls weathered by wind, a crooked barn, a kitchen fire that never went out. But all of that would come undone, not by drought or famine, but by a war that turned neighbors into strangers and made every homestead a battlefield. When the first rumors reached the Turner farm, parliamentarian soldiers riding east, Royalist banners spotted near the market, no one believed that real danger would find them. Like most families in Essex, the Turners cared little for distant politics. They prayed for peace, paid their tithes, and watched the horizon, hoping war would pass them by. But the English Civil War was a storm that spared no one. In 1643, the first parliamentarian company thundered up the road, sabers drawn, demanding grain and shelter in the name of the people's cause. The family watched in terror as soldiers stampeded through their barn, ate every loaf and crumb, and tacked a fresh green and white flag above their front door, a sign to all, this land now belonged to Parliament. But peace lasted only as long as the next patrol. Days later, Royalist cavalry charged in, guns raised, dragging the old flag down and hoisting the king's standard in its place. The men accused the Turners of aiding traitors, beat the father bloody when he protested, then forced the eldest son to kneel and swear loyalty to the crown. When the soldiers left, they took half the farm's winter stores as tax, payment for surviving under the wrong banner. The family learned quickly. No answer was ever safe, no flag brought protection, only the promise of the next invasion. This was only the beginning. By spring, the farm had changed hands again. Parliamentarians returned, seeking vengeance on Royalist sympathizers. They set fire to the family storehouse, forced the mother to hand over the last of their salt pork, and made the youngest children watch as the farm's best horse was led away. Each time the flag changed, green and white, then the king's gold, then Parliament's red, it brought new rules, new taxes, new punishments for old imaginary crimes. The Turners stopped sleeping, jumping at every hoofbeat, whispering prayers that went unanswered. With each takeover, the family lost a little more. The youngest son grew thin from hunger. The mother's hands became raw from scrubbing blood off the kitchen floor after soldiers used their home as a barracks. The father, once proud and strong, began to fade, his spirit beaten down by threats, by endless accusations of disloyalty, by the knowledge that his life's work could be destroyed in a single afternoon. Sometimes the soldiers promised protection in exchange for secrets, demanding names of neighbors who might be hiding food or fugitives. But the Turners knew that betrayal brought no safety. Tomorrow the flag would change again. By the fourth occupation, the farm was a ruin. The roof leaked where musket balls had punched through the tiles. Fields lay fallow, trampled by soldiers' boots and left to choke with weeds. Livestock vanished, claimed by whichever army arrived last. The children stopped asking when the war would end. They only wondered which side would come next, which uniforms they should fear. No matter which flag flew from the door, the threats remained the same. You are traitors if you fed them. You will hang if you resist us. Pay or be burned out. The final flag came in a storm, black clouds overhead, the world so sodden with misery that hope itself seemed to drown. This time no side claimed the farm with shouts or speeches, only with silent menace. The men who arrived wore no colors. Some whispered they were deserters, others thought them vengeful bandits using the war as cover for their own brutality. They took everything that could be carried, beat the father so badly he never walked straight again, and left a warning carved into the farmhouse door. All loyalty is death. When they were gone, the Turner family stood amid the wreckage of what had once been home, shivering, broken, empty. There was nothing left to defend. The land itself had turned against them, every furrow now a scar, every tree a marker of what they had lost. With their stores gone, animals stolen, and home battered by too many hands, the Turners did what countless English families were forced to do. In the dead of night, they gathered what scraps remained and walked away. They left behind the walls built by their ancestors, the fields where their children played, the graves of loved ones who would never know peace. They joined the great silent exodus of the dispossessed, refugees in their own land, cast adrift by a war that saw only flags, never faces. Long after the last battle was fought, the story of the farm that changed flags 5 times survived in local whispers. Neighbors would walk past its ruined shell, remembering the family who had once welcomed everyone with laughter and fresh bread. Some said the farm was cursed, others that its story was a lesson. That in war there are no victors among the innocent, only survivors, only those who run before the next flag arrives. In the end, the Turner family became a symbol for every English home broken by civil war, not famous, not celebrated, just one of the many who lost everything while the great and powerful argued over crowns and causes. The farm story is not a tale of heroes or villains, but of endurance, fear, and the quiet agony of ordinary people caught between forces they could never control. It is the story of how a single patch of earth, claimed and reclaimed until there was nothing left, could be enough to shatter a family and leave nothing behind but silence, empty fields, and the memory of all that was stolen by the war.